1 year had passed since the Battle of Vethus Prime, and the Galactic Council chamber was more crowded than it had ever been. Representatives from 47 species filled every available seat, and thousands more watched through broadcast systems that carried the ceremony to every corner of known space. Admiral Greta Sullivan stood at the center of the chamber and tried to ignore the slight ache in her left leg where the prosthetic connected to her remaining bone. She had lost the original leg during the collision with the Lurker command ship, along with 2 fingers and most of the hearing in her right ear. She had spent 3 months in a Keth medical facility learning to walk again. She had been one of the lucky ones. 47 members of her crew had died in the battle. Their names were carved into a memorial plaque that now hung in the main corridor of every human vessel in the fleet. Kevin Park had survived by reaching an escape pod seconds before the final impact. Paula Brooks had not been so fortunate. Neither had Samuel Hayes. Counselor Threnix stepped forward and began the formal ceremony. His compound eyes were steady now, and his movements had the careful precision of someone who had rehearsed this moment many times. He spoke of courage and sacrifice. He spoke of the debt that the Keth people owed to the humans who had given their lives for Vethus Prime. He spoke of the way that fear could be transformed into something greater when beings chose to stand together against the darkness. Then he presented humanity with full membership in the Galactic Council. The vote had been unanimous, which had never happened before in the Council's 12,000-year history. Every species had agreed that the humans had earned their place among the stars, but Threnix was not finished. He had another announcement to make, one that had been the subject of intense debate for months. The galactic community wanted to send an expedition back into the Shroud. Not to fight the Lurkers, but to understand them. To discover why they harvested organic life. To find out if there was another way. The machines had retreated after the Battle of Vethus Prime, but everyone knew they would return eventually. The next emergence might be larger. The next harvest might not be stopped by a single ship willing to sacrifice itself. Threnix asked humanity to lead the expedition. The humans had crossed the Shroud once already. They knew its dangers better than anyone, and they had proven beyond any possible doubt that they did not give up when things became difficult. Greta listened to the proposal and felt something complicated stirring in her chest. She thought about the crew members she had lost. She thought about the friends who had died in the darkness between stars. She thought about the long journey that had brought humanity to this place, and the even longer journey that apparently lay ahead. She accepted the assignment, but she made a counter-request of her own. She asked that representatives from every willing species join the expedition. Humanity had not survived the Shroud alone. They had survived because they had each other, because they had built communities aboard their generation, ships, and supported one another through the endless years of transit. If the galaxy was going to face the unknown together, they should do it together. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Salith, the ancient Vorn philosopher, who had once struggled to understand human psychology, volunteered before Greta had finished speaking. Yenthus, the Keth commander who had witnessed the final moments of the Horizon's call, stood and pledged his service. One by one, representatives from across the galactic community rose to offer their ships, their crews, their knowledge. After the ceremony ended, Greta found a quiet corner of the station where she could look out at the stars. Kevin Park found her there a few minutes later. He had been promoted to commander in the years since the battle, and he would be serving as her executive officer aboard the newly commissioned flagship of the expedition fleet. Kevin asked her if she really believed they could succeed. The Lurkers had existed for thousands of years. They had technology that the galactic community did not understand. They had survived in the Shroud where nothing else could. What made her think that a fleet of mixed species could do anything except die. Greta was quiet for a long moment before answering. She told him that she did not know if they would succeed. She had no idea what they would find in the depths of the shroud, or how they would deal with the lurkers when they finally confronted them. She could not promise victory or safety or even survival, but she knew one thing for certain. Sitting behind the map's edge and being afraid had never accomplished anything. The only way to find out what was possible was to try. The only way to change the future was to move forward into it. Kevin nodded slowly and did not argue. He had learned something about himself during the Battle of Vithus Prime. He had learned that he was capable of more than he had ever imagined. He had learned that fear did not have to be the end of action. It could be the beginning. The expedition fleet assembled over the following months. Human ships flew alongside Keth vessels and Vorn cruisers and representatives from a dozen other species. Engineers from different civilizations worked together to modify their technologies for the challenges ahead. Scientists pooled their knowledge and developed new theories about the nature of the shroud and the beings who lived within it. At the center of the formation was a newly constructed vessel called the Horizon's Legacy. Her design incorporated lessons learned from the original Horizon's Call, and her hull was reinforced with materials that the Keth had developed over thousands of years of lurker encounters. She was the largest ship humanity had ever built, and she would be Greta's home for however long the expedition lasted. Among the crew of the allied vessels was a young Keth cadet named Chelith. She had joined the expedition on the day applications opened, and she had been accepted despite her lack of experience because her passion was undeniable. She had watched the humans save her world, and she had decided that she wanted to be part of whatever came next. On the day the fleet departed, Chelith recorded a message for her family. She told them she was not afraid. She told them she had seen what humans did when faced with the impossible. They walked toward it anyway. They did not stop at the edge of the map. They did not accept that some things could not be done. She had learned something from them, she said. She had learned that fear could become something else. It could become determination. It could become courage. It could become the foundation of legends that would be told for thousands of years. The fleet engaged engines and began moving toward the shroud. Stars stretched and blurred around them as they accelerated beyond the boundary of known space. Ahead of them lay darkness and danger and the unknown machines that had harvested organic life for longer than civilization had existed. Behind them, the galactic community watched and waited. Some of them expected the expedition to fail. Some of them believed it would never return. But many of them felt something they had not felt in a very long time. They felt hope. Greta stood on the bridge of the Horizon's Legacy and watched the last stars of mapped space disappear behind them. The galactic map ended here. Everything beyond this point was territory that no one had ever explored. She smiled slightly and gave the order to continue forward. This was where the journey began. The first lurker vessel exploded in a burst of white fire that lit up the darkness above Vithos Prime. The second followed moments later, torn apart by a barrage of missiles that the Horizon's Call had been saving for exactly this kind of desperate situation. Kevin Park watched the destruction register on his tactical display and allowed himself a single moment of satisfaction. 2 down, 96 to go. Admiral Sullivan was already calling out new orders. She wanted the ship to use the debris field from the destroyed vessels as cover while they repositioned for the next attack run. She wanted engineering to push the engines past their safety limits. She wanted every weapon system cycling at maximum rate regardless of the strain on the power grid. The Horizon's Call dove through the expanding cloud of wreckage and came out, firing. 3 more lurker ships took damage before the machine fleet could adjust to the unexpected tactics. Human ships were designed for exactly this kind of close-range chaos. They were built to survive conditions that would kill most crews, and their pilots were trained to exploit that advantage. But 96 vessels were still too many. The lurkers began to adapt, spreading out to surround the human ship while maintaining pressure from multiple angles. Energy beams lanced through space, and the Horizon's call shuddered as her shields absorbed hit after hit. Paula Brooks reported from engineering that the shield generators were already showing strain. Another 10 minutes of this, and they would start failing. Greta acknowledged the report without taking her eyes off the tactical display. 10 minutes was more than she had expected to get. On the surface of Vethus Prime, evacuation transports were lifting off from every major settlement. The Cath had practiced for this moment for generations, ever since the last lurker emergence 300 years ago. They knew how to move quickly when the ancient machines appeared. What they had never expected was for someone to buy them time. Chelith watched the battle from her family's courtyard while her parents loaded their belongings onto a ground vehicle. The human ship was weaving through the lurker fleet like a small animal evading larger predators. Every few seconds it would fire, and another enemy vessel would take damage or explode entirely. But the lurkers were landing hits too, and even from the surface Chelith could see the flashes of impact against the human shields. Her father called for her to get in the vehicle. They needed to reach the transport station before the last ships departed. But Chelith could not stop watching. She had never seen anything like this. She had never imagined that anyone would fight for her world this way. Aboard the Horizon's call, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Hull breaches had opened on 3 decks, and damage control teams were struggling to seal them before the atmosphere vented completely. The medical bay was filling with wounded crew members, and Dr. Samuel Hayes was performing surgery while the ship bucked and twisted around him. Kevin reported that the lurkers had changed their formation. They were no longer trying to destroy the human ship outright. Instead, they were hurting it, pushing it away from the planet while a smaller group broke off toward the surface. The machines were adapting to the interference and resuming their original mission. Greta saw what was happening and made a decision that would be discussed in military academies throughout the galaxy for centuries to come. She ordered the helm to reverse course and drive directly into the center of the lurker fleet. Not around them, not through a gap in their formation, but straight into the densest concentration of enemy vessels. Kevin asked her to repeat the order. She did, and added that he should prepare a full spread of missiles for launch on her command. The Horizons call turned and accelerated toward the enemy fleet. Lurker vessels fired continuously as she approached, and the ship's shields finally began to fail under the sustained assault. Sections of hull plating tore away. Entire compartments decompressed. The lights flickered as the power grid struggled to maintain critical systems. Commander Yenthus, a Keth military observer who had been assigned to the human fleet as a liaison, stood on the bridge and watched the destruction unfold around him. He had served in the Keth Navy for over 60 years. He had seen battles and skirmishes and desperate last stands, but he had never seen anything like this. He asked Admiral Sullivan why her crew was not abandoning ship. The lurkers were moments away from destroying them completely. Any rational being would be heading for the escape pods. Greta glanced at him briefly before returning her attention to the tactical display. She told him that the evacuation transports had not finished loading. There were still civilians on the surface waiting for rescue. Her crew would hold until the job was done or until they were dead. There was no third option. Yenthus looked around the bridge at the human officers. Every single one of them was focused entirely on their duties. No one was panicking. No one was crying or screaming or trying to escape. They had accepted that they were probably going to die, and they had chosen to keep fighting anyway. The Horizons call reached the center of the lurker fleet, and Greta gave the order to fire everything. Missiles and energy beams erupted from the human ship in every direction, striking dozens of enemy vessels at once. The Lurker command ship took a direct hit to its primary systems, and the machine fleet suddenly lost coordination. But it was not enough. The Lurkers regrouped within seconds, and their return fire tore through what remained of the human defenses. The Horizon's call was dying, her hull cracked and burning, her systems failing one by one. Greta looked at the tactical display one last time and saw something that made her smile despite everything. The last evacuation transport had lifted off from Vithos Prime. The civilians were safe. She ordered Kevin to set a collision course for the Lurker command ship. He complied without hesitation. The Horizon's call, trailing fire and debris, accelerated toward the largest enemy vessel. The Lurkers tried to evade, but the human ship was too close and moving too fast. The impact shattered both vessels and sent a shockwave through the surrounding fleet that destroyed or disabled another dozen machines. In the chaos that followed, the remaining Lurkers scattered. Their coordination was broken. Their command structure was gone. They retreated back toward the shroud in disarray, leaving the skies above Vithos Prime clear for the first time since the battle began. Yenthus survived the collision by reaching an escape pod moments before impact. As his pod drifted through the debris field, he activated his communication system and sent a single message to the Keth homeworld. He told them that he understood now why the shroud had not killed the humans. It was because the humans were more frightening than anything the shroud contained. They were a species that would fly a burning ship into an enemy fleet to save people they had never met. They were a species that did not know how to stop fighting, even when fighting was hopeless. He told them that he had just witnessed the birth of a legend on the surface of Vithos Prime. Chelith finally climbed into her family's vehicle. She was crying, though she did not fully understand why. The human ship was gone, destroyed in the final attack that had saved her world. The beings who had crewed that vessel were probably all dead. But as the vehicle drove toward the transport station, Chelith made a promise to herself. She would remember what she had seen today. She would tell the story to everyone who would listen. She would make sure that the galaxy knew what the humans had done. She did not know their names or their faces or their histories. She only knew that they had been willing to die for strangers, and that was something worth remembering. The sensors detected the movement 3 weeks after the formal inquiry ended. Lieutenant Kevin Park was the first to see the readings, and for a moment he simply stared at his display without comprehension. The numbers did not make sense. Nothing was supposed to come out of the shroud, except the humans who had already arrived. He called Admiral Sullivan to the bridge immediately. Greta arrived within minutes. Her gray hair still damp from the shower she had been taking when the alert sounded. She looked at the sensor data and felt something cold settle in her stomach. Multiple contacts were emerging from the shroud, and they were moving fast. Their energy signatures were unlike anything in the human database, but there was something about their formation that suggested purpose. These were not lost ships or drifting debris. These were hunters. She asked Kevin how many contacts they were tracking. He told her the current count was 43, but more were appearing every few minutes. Greta had commanded ships for over 30 years. She had faced pirates and rebels and natural disasters that would have killed crews less prepared than hers. But she had never faced anything like this. The human fleet that had crossed the shroud consisted of 9 battered vessels. Most of them were transports or science ships with minimal armament. The Horizon's Call was the only true warship in the group, and even she was designed for escort duty rather than fleet combat. 43. Contacts became 61, became 84. The emerging fleet spread out in a pattern that military minds throughout the galaxy would have recognized as an encirclement formation. Whatever was coming out of the shroud was not stumbling into known space by accident. It knew exactly what it was doing. A transmission burst across all frequencies. The message was not in any language that humanity or the galactic community recognized, but the mathematical patterns embedded within it were universal. Numbers, coordinates, and something else. Something that Kevin's translation software eventually rendered as a single concept repeated over and over. Harvest. Counselor. Threnix contacted the Horizon's call within the hour. His compound eyes were moving rapidly, which Greta had learned was a sign of extreme agitation in the Keth species. He told her that the Galactic Council had identified the emerging ships. They were called the Lurkers, and they were the reason the Shroud had claimed every expedition sent into it. For 12,000 years, the Lurkers were machine intelligences of unknown origin. They had existed in the Shroud for longer than any galactic records could trace. Every few centuries, they emerged to harvest organic life from the border regions before retreating back into the darkness. No one knew why they did this. No one knew what they did with the beings they took. The galactic community had simply learned to abandon the border worlds whenever the Lurkers appeared and wait for them to leave. Greta asked, how many worlds were in the current projected path of the Lurker fleet? Threnix told her there were 7, but only one was populated. Vithos Prime was a Keth agricultural colony with approximately 6 million inhabitants. The Keth Navy was scrambling to respond, but their nearest ships were at least 12 hours away. She asked how long before the Lurkers reached Vithos Prime. Threnix was silent for a moment before answering. 3 hours. Perhaps less. Greta looked at Kevin and saw the same calculation happening behind his eyes. The Horizon's call was 2 hours from Vithos Prime at maximum speed. They could arrive before the Lurkers did. They could be there when the attack began. They could not possibly win. Kevin asked what she wanted to do. His voice was steady, but she could see his hands trembling slightly on the console. He was 26 years old. He had joined the fleet because he wanted to see what lay beyond the stars. He had not signed up to die fighting ancient machines in defense of a species he had only just learned existed. Greta made her decision without hesitation. She ordered the helm to set course for Vithos Prime at maximum speed. She ordered all crew to battle stations. She ordered the communication officer to send a message to the other human ships, explaining what she intended to do. Kevin did not ask for clarification. He simply began preparing the weapon systems. The next 2 hours passed in tense silence. Greta spent most of them walking through the ship, talking to crew members, making sure everyone understood what they were flying into. She did not lie to them. She told them the odds were terrible. She told them they would probably die. She told them she would not think less of anyone who wanted to evacuate via escape pod before they reached the combat zone. No one left. Paula Brooks, the chief engineer, told Greta that she had not crossed the Shroud just to run away from the first real fight they encountered. Kevin Park said that there were 6 million people on that planet who had never done anything to hurt anyone, and he was not going to let them die without at least trying to help. The ship's doctor, an older man named Samuel Hayes, simply smiled and said that he had taken an oath to preserve life, and he intended to keep it for as long as he could. Greta returned to the bridge as Vithos Prime came into view on the forward sensors. The planet was beautiful, covered in vast fields of purple vegetation that the Keth cultivated for food. She could see small settlements scattered across the continents, farming communities that had existed in peace for generations. The Lurker fleet was already visible on the opposite side of the planet, a swarm of dark angular shapes that blotted out the stars behind them. Greta opened a channel to the Lurker command vessel. She identified herself as Admiral Greta Sullivan of the Earth Defense Fleet. She informed the machines that Vithos Prime was now under human protection. She gave them one chance to withdraw. The response came in that same mathematical language. A single concept transmitted across all frequencies. Harvest. Greta closed the channel and looked at Kevin. She told him to target the lead vessel and fire everything they had. The Horizon's call accelerated toward the Lurker fleet, and the battle for Vethus Prime began. On the surface below, a young Keth named Chelith stood in the courtyard of her family's farm and watched the sky. She had heard the evacuation alerts, but there was no time to reach the transport ships. There was no time to do anything except stand here and watch the end approach. Then she saw something that made no sense. A single ship was flying toward the Lurker Armada. One ship against nearly 100. It was firing as it flew, and the Lurker vessels were actually reacting to it, turning to engage this tiny attacker that had appeared from nowhere. Chelith did not know what species crewed that ship. She did not know why they were fighting. She only knew that someone had come to help when no one else could arrive in time. She watched the impossible battle unfold above her world and felt something she had not expected to feel. She felt hope. The formal inquiry began 3 days after humanity's introduction to the Galactic Council. 17 species had demanded it, each one convinced that the humans must be hiding something. No civilization simply crossed the shroud through determination alone. There had to be secret technology involved, or perhaps some kind of biological modification that allowed them to survive conditions that killed everyone else. Dr. Nina Cole stood at the center of the inquiry chamber and tried not to feel intimidated by the hundreds of alien eyes fixed upon her. She was a historian by training, which meant she had spent most of her career studying the past rather than standing in front of hostile audiences. But Admiral Sullivan had asked her to do this. And Nina had learned long ago that when Greta Sullivan asked for something, it was usually important. The chamber was smaller than the main council hall, but it was still impressive. Curved walls rose around her in tiers of seating, and holographic displays floated in the air at various heights. The lighting had been adjusted to accommodate species that saw in different parts of the spectrum, which gave the room a strange shifting quality. Nina took a deep breath and began. She told them about Earth. She described a world where the continents drifted on plates of molten rock, creating earthquakes that could level entire cities. She showed them footage of hurricanes and tornadoes, of floods and droughts, of volcanic eruptions that buried towns in ash. She explained that humans had evolved on a planet that experienced regular extinction events, and that their species had nearly been wiped out several times before they even developed basic tools. A Talith representative interrupted to ask if Earth was considered a death world. Nina smiled and said that by galactic standards, it almost certainly was. Gravity was higher than the galactic average. The atmosphere contained a gas called oxygen that was technically poisonous to many life forms. The climate swung between extremes that would kill most species within hours of exposure. And yet humans had not merely survived on this world. They had thrived. They had built civilizations in frozen wastelands and scorching deserts. They had climbed mountains where the air was too thin to breathe and descended into ocean trenches where the pressure would crush most vessels. They had done these things not because they had to, but because they wanted to see what was there. The inquiry chamber had gone very quiet. Nina continued. She showed them footage that the humans had brought from Earth. A human climbing a vertical ice wall with nothing but metal spikes attached to their boots and hands. A human jumping from a flying vehicle and falling toward the ground for several minutes before deploying a fabric device that slowed their descent. Humans swimming in waters known to contain predators capable of biting them in half. Humans entering burning buildings to rescue others who were trapped inside. Salith, the ancient Vorn philosopher, activated a translator and asked if these were examples of military training. The question was sincere. It seemed like the only logical explanation. Nina laughed softly and said no. These were hobbies. Things that humans did for entertainment. The climbing was called mountaineering. The falling was called skydiving. The swimming was called surfing, and the predators were called sharks. And humans did this for fun, even though dozens of them died every year. The translator systems throughout the chamber struggled with the concept. Several species did not have words for voluntary exposure to mortal danger as a form of recreation. The Vorn delegate pulsed with colors that indicated profound confusion. Nina let the silence stretch for a moment before continuing. She explained that humans had a strained relationship with fear. They felt it just as strongly as any other species, perhaps even more strongly. But rather than avoiding things that frightened them, humans often sought those things out. They seemed to believe that conquering fear was a worthwhile goal in itself. They climbed mountains because the mountains were there. They crossed oceans because they wanted to know what lay on the other side. They entered the shroud because everyone said it was impossible. She pulled up a new set of images. These showed the generation ships that humanity had built when they first detected the shroud blocking their expansion. The ships were massive, designed to sustain populations for decades or even centuries. They had farms and schools and hospitals. Children were born on these vessels, knowing nothing but the metal walls around them and the endless dark outside. Nina explained that the crossing had taken 87 years. 3 generations of humans had lived and died aboard those ships without ever seeing a planet or breathing unfiltered air. They had done this willingly. Parents had signed up knowing that their grandchildren might be the first to see what lay beyond the shroud. And they had considered this an acceptable trade. A Keth representative named Yenthus asked how this was possible. How could any rational being sacrifice their own life for a goal they would never see achieved? What possible motivation could justify such a choice? Nina considered the question carefully before answering. She said that humans were not immortal. They lived on average for about 80 years. This was shorter than most spacefaring species, and humans were painfully aware of their limited time. But rather than making them cautious, this awareness seemed to drive them forward. They knew they could not see everything or do everything or understand everything. So they tried to contribute to something larger than themselves. They planted trees whose shade they would never sit beneath. They built monuments their hands would never touch once completed. They sent their children into the unknown with nothing but hope and determination. She looked around the chamber at the assembled representatives. She told them that humanity did not map the edges of the possible and stop. They saw the edge, acknowledged the danger, and then asked what was on the other side. They had done this throughout their history. They had done it with every ocean, every mountain, every frontier that had ever blocked their path. The shroud was simply the largest edge they had ever encountered. Salus spoke again, and this time, the Vorn's colors had shifted to something that the translation systems rendered as profound unease. Salith asked what humanity planned to do now that they had reached this side of the shroud. Nina smiled at this question. She said that humanity wanted to meet their neighbors. They wanted to learn. They wanted to explore this new region of space that was so different from everything they had known. They wanted to see what wonders the galaxy contained. But mostly, she said, they wanted to make friends. Humans were social creatures. They had evolved in groups and tribes and nations. They found meaning in connection and shared purpose, in working alongside others toward common goals. They had crossed the uncrossable darkness specifically because they had hoped to find someone on the other side. The chamber was silent for a long moment after Nina finished speaking. Then, one by one, the representatives began to leave. Some of them looked thoughtful. Some of them looked disturbed. A few of them looked at Nina with something that might have been respect. Salith was the last to depart. The ancient Vorm paused at the doorway and turned back to face Nina. The translator rendered Salith's final words with unusual precision. The Vorn said that in 12,000 years of galactic civilization, no species had ever frightened Salith as much as humans did. Not because humans were aggressive or cruel or dangerous in the traditional sense, but because humans genuinely did not understand why the Shroud should have stopped them. They looked at the impossible and saw only another problem to be solved. Nina watched Salith leave and wondered if that was meant as a compliment or a warning. With humans, she supposed it was probably both. The chamber was enormous. It stretched upward for nearly 100 meters, and the walls were covered with glowing screens that showed every star system the galaxy had ever mapped. Representatives from 47 different species sat in curved rows that circled the central platform, and every single one of them was silent. They had been silent for almost 3 minutes now, ever since Counselor Threnix had finished speaking. Threnix was a Keth, which meant he stood nearly 3 meters tall and had 6 limbs covered in hard black plates. His eyes were compound structures that glittered in the chamber lights, and right now those eyes were fixed on the small group of creatures standing on the central platform. The creatures were soft. They had no armor, no claws, no venom glands, no natural weapons of any kind. They stood on 2 legs and had only 2 arms, and their skin was so thin that Threnix could see the blood moving beneath it. They called themselves humans. The silence continued. Threnix expected shock, but this was something deeper. This was fear. Every species in the chamber had grown up with stories about the Shroud, that vast region of space where the galactic map simply ended. Probes sent into the Shroud never returned. Ships that crossed its border vanished forever. For 12,000 years, the Shroud had been the one thing every civilization agreed upon. It was death. It was the end of everything. Nothing survived the Shroud, and yet these humans had emerged from it 3 weeks ago, flying ships that were battered and scarred, but very much functional. They had crossed the uncrossable. They had survived the unsurvivable. And now they were standing in the most important chamber in known space, waiting for someone to speak. A Vorn representative finally broke the silence. Salith was ancient, even by Vorn standards, a gelatinous being that pulsed with soft blue light. When Salith spoke, the translator systems rendered the words in a voice that trembled slightly. The Vorn wanted to know if this was some kind of trick. Perhaps the humans had found another route. Perhaps they had never actually entered the Shroud at all. The human at the front of the group stepped forward. Her name was Greta Sullivan, and she held the rank of admiral in something called the Earth Defense Fleet. She was small by galactic standards, barely over 1.5 meters tall. Her hair had gone gray at the temples, and there were lines on her face that suggested she had spent many years making difficult decisions. When she spoke, her voice was calm and clear. She told Salith that there was no trick. Her people had entered the Shroud from the other side, from a region of space that the galactic community had never reached. They had spent 4 generations crossing it. They had lost ships and crew members. They had mourned their dead and kept going. The Shroud was dangerous, yes. It was full of spatial anomalies and strange energy fields and things that hunted in the dark between stars. But it was not impossible. It was simply hard. Another representative spoke up. This was a Tailith, a small furry creature with enormous ears and a nervous disposition. The Tailith wanted to know why. Why would any species attempt such a crossing when the risks were so extreme? Surely there were easier paths to expansion. Surely there were safer ways to explore. Greta smiled at this question, and something in that smile made several of the nearby representatives lean back in their seats. She explained that humanity came from a world called Earth. It was a beautiful world in many ways, but it had also spent millions of years trying very hard to kill everything that lived on it. Ice ages had covered the continents in glaciers. Volcanic eruptions had darkened the skies for decades. Asteroids had struck the surface and wiped out entire branches of life. Plagues had swept through populations. Predators had hunted humans in the darkness, and yet humans had survived. They had survived because they were stubborn in ways that other species might find difficult to understand. When a mountain stood in their path, they climbed it. When an ocean blocked their way, they built boats and crossed it. When their own world became too small for their numbers, they built ships and left it behind. The Shroud was simply the latest in a very long line of things that had tried to stop humanity from moving forward. Thrinix listened to this and felt a cold sensation spreading through his thorax. He had lived for nearly 300 years. He had studied hundreds of species. He understood ambition and curiosity and even recklessness. But what this human was describing was something else entirely. It was a fundamental refusal to accept limits. It was a species-wide inability to recognize when something was impossible. He asked Greta Sullivan a question. He wanted to know how many humans had died in the crossing, how many ships had been lost, what the true cost had been. Greta was quiet for a moment. Then she answered. 17 ships had begun the crossing. 9 had completed it. Over 6,000 humans had died in the Shroud, including 3 of her own crew members who had succumbed to injuries sustained in the final transit. She knew every single one of their names. Thrinix expected her to stop there, but she continued. She said that the humans who had died in the Shroud were not forgotten. Their names were carved into the hulls of the surviving ships. Their stories were told to every child born in the fleet. They had died so that humanity could reach this place, this chamber, this moment of first contact with a galactic community they had only dreamed about. And was it worth it, Thrinix asked? Were those deaths justified by what had been gained? Greta looked at him with eyes that held no doubt whatsoever. She said that every human who had joined the expedition knew the risks. They had volunteered anyway. They had done so because humanity believed that some things were more important than individual survival. Knowledge was important. Discovery was important. The chance to meet other thinking beings in a universe that often seemed empty and cold was important. She paused and looked around the chamber at the dozens of alien faces staring back at her. Then she said something that Thrinix would remember for the rest of his very long life. She said that the galactic map ended at the Shroud. For every species in this chamber, that boundary represented the final edge of the possible. But for humans, it was simply where the journey began. They did not see edges as endings. They saw them as invitations. They saw them as challenges waiting to be overcome. The chamber remained silent, but the quality of the silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of shock. It was the silence of beings who were beginning to understand that something fundamental had shifted in the galaxy. A new species had arrived, and this species did not play by the same rules as everyone else. Thrinix found himself wondering what would happen now. He had spent his entire career maintaining order, preserving stability, ensuring that the galactic community continued to function as it always had. But these humans did not seem interested in stability. They seemed interested in motion, in growth, in pushing forward regardless of consequences. He looked at Greta Sullivan and saw a woman who had watched friends die in the void between stars and had not turned back. He saw a representative of a species that considered danger to be an acceptable price for discovery. And for the first time in 300 years, Counselor Thrinix felt something he had almost forgotten was possible. He felt afraid.